and there are no true knights among you!
Compared to the cutthroat struggle we see for the Iron Throne in Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is comparatively a lot more chill. Set 209 years after Aegon's conquest, 100 years after the Dance of the Dragons, and almost 90 years before the events of Game of Thrones proper, this was an era of peace ushered by the rule of King Daeron II Targaryen, aka Daeron the Good. In fact, we might barely see any of this silver-haired royalty as the tales of Dunk and Egg mostly follow Sir Duncan the Tall and his quirky squire Egg going on adventures, and mostly dealing with the common folk of Flea Bottom. From the first episode of the show, it seems like A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is going to adapt the first novella in the series, titled The Hedge Knight. The first 2 issues of this graphic novel have already been adapted in the pilot, and like any show, there are a good chunk of differences between the book and what's being translated onto screen. If history is any evidence, we've all seen how most of George R.R. Martin's works have a habit of starting off as a faithful adaptation, only to stray further away from the books as the seasons progress. But that will apparently not be the case with this prequel Game of Thrones spin-off, because Martin himself had a say in all the changes made for the show. Having said that, let's discuss the glaring changes we've seen so far in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms in just the first episode, in their attempts to adapt The Hedge Knight. Let's get into it.
Am I to be a knight one day, sir? As you are?
Dunk has not spoken about Sir Arlan's backstory in the show yet, so The Hedge Knight also begins exactly how A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms does, on a rainy day, with Dunk digging up a grave for Sir Arlan of Pennytree and laying his body on the ground. Compared to the show, the book actually has a lot more material on Dunk's eulogy for his guardian. In The Hedge Knight, we're privy to Dunk's inner thoughts, where he mentions how Sir Arlan had lived a long life and he was closer to turning 60, but the boy believed Arlan's death would be different because the man died after catching a cold while they were on their way to Ashford Meadow for the tournament. Even though we do believe the show will let us in on the man's backstory at some point, the graphic novel unravels how Sir Arlan lived and died as a hedge knight right on the second page. Arlan rode from keep to keep, offering his services to different lords and fighting their battles. He ate in their halls until the war was done and moved on after collecting his coin. Not just wars either, as Dunk mentions in the book, he participated in tournaments as well, but Sir Arlan had not ridden in a joust since the time he faced the Prince of Dragonstone, Baelor Targaryen, in a tournament at Storm's End, where he claimed to have broken 7 lances against the prince. Even though he lost that joust, Arlan considered it a victory, because according to him, not every man can boast that they broke 7 lances against the finest knight in the Seven Kingdoms, and so, after that prestigious showing, he chose never to joust again. In the book, Dunk thinks to himself how he always thought that Arlan would die with the same honor, on the battlefield, instead of a muddy road. From here on, the show follows suit on the exact dialogue we see in the book, with Dunk paying his respects to Sir Arlan before burying him. The only difference here is that for a split second, we see him consider finding another hedge knight to squire for, but like in the show, after Dunk unsheaths Arlan's sword, he chooses to participate in the tournament at Ashford Meadow and become a true knight.
What you?
Himself. The Hedge Knight does not have any flashbacks of Dunk being abused. So a huge part of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms shows us how Sir Arlan would beat or slap Dunk every time he made a mistake, be it as a child or as an adult. During his monologue, where he pays his tribute to Arlan by saying a few words, Dunk mentions how the man was a true knight and never beat him when he didn't deserve it, except for that one time in Maidenpool when an inn boy ate a widow woman's pie and blamed him for it. We then see a transition of Dunk getting slapped by Arlan, which doesn't exist in the book. From what it looks like in the show, the first episode tries to paint Dunk's relationship with Arlan in a complicated light, but the book always portrayed him as a man trying to do his best in raising Dunk. In the show, the abuse has to be a part of it because even when he takes in Egg as his squire, he vows to never beat him for no reason. Having said that, Arlan will always be a huge part of Dunk's life because if it weren't for the Hedge Knight, he would never go on to become Duncan the Tall in the truest sense and eventually become the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. So we're really very excited to see how the show handles this particular subplot in the first season. We do not see Sir Duncan the Tall's unceremonious crouch in the book. As we previously mentioned, by the looks of the first episode, Season 1 of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms will probably be as loyal an adaptation as one could get, and being an ardent fan of Martin's work, nothing makes me happier than that. But we definitely weren't expecting A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms to make such a spectacle that it would be nothing like its predecessors, that too so early on, as we literally see them taking a literal dump on the infamous ending that came before. When the Game of Thrones theme started to play, away and the show began to tease us with a foreboding moment, our ears perked up like a dog hearing the doorbell. But I swear nothing could have prepared us for our expectations being cut so criminally short, with the theme song abruptly being paused in the middle as we get a close-up of Dunk's bare ass crouched behind a tree as he defecates. In the book, there's absolutely no sign of the boy who would go on to become the legendary Sir Duncan the Tall shooting a streaming fountain out of his ass, but the show uses this comedic moment to prove that the plot will be much funnier than what we've read in The Hedge Knight. As bizarre and hilarious as this unceremonious crouch was, we're definitely not complaining. Plummer lacks his sense of humor in the book. So among the many changes that were made for the show, one thing that we're probably going to keep noticing throughout is just how much more humorous it is compared to the novella, where really almost nobody has enough time to waste on a joke. More importantly, you should note that after Dunk reached Ashford Meadow in the show, we see him immediately go in search of the Master of the Games to register his name for the tournament. But given that this was an era brimming with knights, the Master of Games didn't know of a Sir Arlan of Pennytree who had apparently knighted Dunk before his passing. You and I both know that that's a lie, but Dunk is really just trying to wing it at life at this point. When the Master of Games asks for a witness who might have seen Arlan dub Dunk as a knight, the boy mentions that the only witness present was a robin perched on top of a thorn tree. In response, the Master of Games warns Dunk how in Ashford Town, men who lie about sacred oaths are hung naked by their hands and feet as they are lowered down butt first onto a sharp point and then impaled. This punishment is apparently known as the Ashford Chair. You could actually see the horror on Dunk's face as he starts to stutter and rethink his plan, but at that moment, the Master of Games breaks into laughter as he breaks character to mention how it's just a joke because there was no Ashford Chair in the Reach. This particular exchange wasn't a part of the book and was added solely to the show. The rest of the interaction in the show remains the same as we see in The Hedge Knight, where the man asks Dunk to go get one of the true knights to vouch for him so he could participate in the tourney, and that's how he goes in search of Sir Manfred of House Dondarrion. However, there are a few minimal time changes made in the show because you see, in The Hedge Knight, Dunk washes himself in a pond before he even visits the town. We see him look at the dragonflies and remember how Sir Arlan told him about the time he visited King's Landing with his grandfather to see the last dragon during the reign of Aegon the Unlucky, who, by the way, was Daemon and Rhaenyra's son. He goes to meet Plummer, who's the Master of Arms in the book, after he goes through town looking to buy some armor to prepare for the tournament. In fact, we see the scene take place in the show in the span of one day, but in the book it's stretched into 2 days, where at the end of the first day, Dunk comes back to his resting place for the night to find Egg and takes him in as his squire, following which they share a badly cooked fish made by Egg. It's actually the next morning when Dunk goes back into town in search of Plummer to register for the tourney. But from the looks of it, a lot of these scenes will be juggled around in the show, but so far they don't feel like bad changes, just little things to help. Dunk's interaction with obnoxious knights from the Kingsguard was cut from the show. So in the show, we see Dunk reach Ashford Meadow and go looking directly for the Master of Games. After that interaction, he goes through town in search of Sir Manfred Dondarrion, not once but twice. The first time, his search proves to be fruitless, and so he goes to wash himself far away from the main grounds before resuming his search. While we do see him interact with Sir Stefan Fossaway, who challenges him to practice jousting with him during the first round, it's after this that Dunk decides to find a quieter place to spend the night, miles away from the main town. In the book, however, he washes himself first, then goes in search of Steely Pate to buy some armor for the tournament, and then comes to find Egg cooking a fish on a fire after tending to his horses. The next morning, the first thing Dunk does in the book is find Plummer to register for the tournament, and after realizing he needed a knight to vouch for him and money to buy himself armor, Dunk goes in search of a stable boy and asks him to lead him to Lord Ashford's Master of Horses. That's when the Knights of the Kingsguard, bearing the House Targaryen banner, ride in on their horses and command Dunk to tend to said horses. When Dunk ignores him, the knight wearing red repeats himself, only for Dunk to sheepishly mention how he was not the stable boy. The knight, in response, calls him dumb, and once again asks Dunk to fetch him some wine and a pretty wench. That's when Dunk looks at the knight straight in the eye and declares that he was no serving man, but a man with the honor to be a knight. The obnoxious knight from the Kingsguard then chastises Dunk by saying how knighthood has fallen on sad days, and then gives the same command to the next boy in sight. This scene has been completely cut from the show, and while we don't know why, we think it would have been cool to see the class disparity through this scene, especially given how obnoxious knights from high families feel so entitled to expect just about everyone to do their bidding bidding. Having said that, the graphic novel also documents Dunk interacting with Sir Roland Crakehall and Sir Donnell Duskendale, two sworn knights of Ashford dressed in silver and gold. They mention how they couldn't enter the lists of the tourney because Prince Valar was one of Lady Ashford's champions and two of his cousins were meant to challenge one another, so they couldn't fight against those they had vowed to protect, meaning these knights had just come to watch. This was the only nice conversation that Dunk had with kinder knights as compared to the rest we see in both the book and episode 1 of the show. In the book, Dunk did mention feeling lucky that he wouldn't be facing the Kingsguard because he clearly didn't have the skill for it. The horde of prostitutes are missing in the book. So we don't know if you guys noticed, but the novella following the tales of Dunk and Egg is certainly lacking in female characters, which is something the show uses to its benefit by creating two new female characters with funny lines. In his search for Sir Manfred Dondarrion during his first roundabout, Dunk comes across two red-headed sex workers named Red and Beanie. They tell him Manfred was napping after spending some quality time with them, and so Dunk goes on his way. Eventually, he returns once again in search of Sir Manfred, and like the chorus in a Greek tragedy, Red and Beanie are again present to give Dunk the disappointing news of Manfred's absence and then provide their own solicited external commentary to the situation. When Dunk calls them out for making fun of him, they instantly warm up to him. We honestly believe the show did a great job adding this little exchange because, in our opinion, Red and Beanie draw an apt parallelism when they compare knighthood to sex work in the way that both professions entail using one's body and putting it at risk for the entertainment of others. The comments help Dunk, and by extension the audience, see knighthood from a bleaker perspective beyond the glory, which is particularly fitting of hedge knights like Dunk himself. When one of them asks Dunk to be kind to his body because it would be the last one he'd have, it seems very fitting for what's in store for him at the tournament, which is drawing nearer. The puppet shows are grander in the show. As we've mentioned a few times, most of the scenes in the first episode are taken straight out of the novella, with some of the dialogue directly lifted from the Hedge Knight graphic novel for the show, which means there's only room left over for very tiny changes or cuts. Now, one visual difference we see in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is definitely the puppet shows, which seems to be a very big part of the book during both times that Dunk visits the main town. Even if the puppet show isn't given much screen time in the episode, the show gives us a spectacular puppet show with literal human-sized puppets that certainly managed to achieve a maximum level of entertainment both for us and the Westerosi people enjoying them from within the puppeteer's tent. However, the book takes a different route as the puppets are described as normal-sized dolls whose strings were being pulled by a tall female puppeteer named Tansel. The showbox is small enough for her to pull the strings, but also large enough to keep the public mesmerized with the tales of a Sir Arlan and the red dragon he killed. While the voices for the characters were also given by Tansel, it seemed like they were using sawdust for the dramatic dragon fire effect. Dunk doesn't sell his palfrey, Sweetfoot, to buy his armor in the show. Well, admittedly, there's a pretty high chance this might actually happen in the next episode because they're clearly shifting scenes around to fit the show better, but in the book, we see Dunk decide to sell his horse, Sweetfoot, in order to buy his own armor to prepare for the tournament. Given how much he loved his horses, this couldn't have been an easy choice for him, but he had no other option and remembered how Sir Arlan always told him how a knight should never love a horse. So he initially reached out to the Master of Horses at Ashford to sell Sweetfoot, but given how busy he was with the tourney, the Master of Horses suggested Dunk take Sweetfoot into town to a man named Henley. At first, Henley calls Sweetfoot a fine-looking beast, but after Dunk asks for 3,000 silvers, he starts to point out mistakes. After a bit of a haggle, Dunk, with a heavy heart, lets go of Sweetfoot for 750 silvers. Before leaving, he asks Henley to give Sweetfoot some oats and an apple at night, which was heartbreakingly sweet. We then see Dunk going back to the main ground to find Steely Pate to collect his armor in exchange for 600 silvers and Arlan's old armor. If you've read the book, you know exactly how that haggle went down, and just how optimistic Dunk seemed to be about being a knight, especially because he placed his order with Steely Pate before he even went to see Plumber to register himself in the tournament. We're inclined to believe that we're going to see this whole scene unfold after Dunk convinces Prince Baelor to vouch for his participation in the tourney, which might just happen in the next episode. Dunk tries to flirt with a puppeteer in the book. So Tansel the puppeteer has not yet been introduced in the show, but given how vital she is to Dunk's character arc, we think we're going to see her in the next episode. Now, during the two times that Dunk visits the town fair and the pavilions, we see him admiring the tall woman with black hair and sharp features pulling at the strings of the puppets. When Dunk first saw her, he thought that while the puppets were skillfully crafted and perfectly manipulated, he was actually admiring the puppeteer more than the puppets. In fact, the first time around, he wanted to toss a copper towards her, but had none. However, during his second visit, after Dunk sold his horse and was on his way to collect his armor, he stopped to admire Tansel's beauty once again as she told the story of Sir Arlan. However, this time, after the show was over, Dunk did toss her a copper coin while praising it. He thought her smile was very sweet and that she was very pretty. Given how tall Tansel was, Dunk imagined that he wouldn't have to kneel in order to kiss her. He then mustered up the courage to ask her to drink a horn of ale with him or eat a sausage, but Tansel politely declined his offer, saying she had another show. When he was leaving, Dunk realized he was being a fool, especially after he saw Tansel laughing at him with another woman. Seeing that, Dunk decided that jousting should have been his priority rather than kissing. Well, that's a rough one, but we hope he does end up getting to share that drink with Tansel in the show. Dunk's conversation with Sir Manfred lasted longer in the book. So, in the show, we see Dunk finally stumble upon Sir Manfred Dondarrion after spending a gala time with Lord Lyonel Baratheon at his party. Sadly, Manfred is nothing like Dunk had imagined, as he turns out to be cut from a wholly different and entirely more pretentious cloth than his Game of Thrones relative, Beric Dondarrion. He's clearly a womanizer and something of a drunk, because Dunk finds him giggling with two girls in his arms and almost hates it that some random dude is keeping him from having his fun. When Dunk tries to explain his situation and how he needs Manfred to vouch for him, the latter declines because he simply doesn't remember any Arlan of Pennytree, or Dunk for that matter. In fact, many knights had taken a wound for his father during battle, but that didn't mean Manfred would go around vouching for them all, and so he leaves Dunk at a loss, who then begins to sulk. Now, this interaction is actually fleshed out for over 3 pages in the book, where Sir Manfred appears to be an intense man instead of a womanizer. After selling his horse and buying his armor, Dunk visits Manfred's pavilion to tell him about his situation, but here too, Dunk was quickly dismissed. What the show cut out was one last plea that Dunk made for his case by quoting Manfred's father, telling the camp how the Dondarrion house got its sigil, but he was at least interested because, according to Manfred, everyone who has ever served his father has heard that story. Therefore, knowing it didn't exactly make Dunk a knight. We don't really hate the tweaks they made for Manfred Dondarrion's character for the show, because just like in the book, we see him as a pompous, entitled jerk who wouldn't waste a single moment over someone as helpless as Dunk. The Lyonel Baratheon scene was exclusively added in the show. At the risk of repeating myself a bit, Dunk and Egg really do feel like they've been lifted directly from the page to the screen, because the tone and scale is exactly what it should be for a smaller, lighter story. But even though the show lifted dialogue written by Martin, some form of expansion is still necessary to fit the larger premise. So far, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms cast is one of the best things about the show, but a major highlight, or should we say deviation, is the surprising introduction of Daniel Ings as Lyonel Baratheon, who brings a fun character to life in an even bigger and better way than imagined. So, in the book, Lyonel competes in the tourney at Ashford Meadow, which is very important in the Hedge Knight's story, but we don't actually get to spend too much time with him. He does play an important role later on, but in these early stages, Dunk only watches him from afar. Like most famous Baratheons who have come before or after him, Lyonel is someone who delights the crowd with his booming laugh, which has earned him the nickname the Laughing Storm, as he faces opponents, winning their support. But A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms takes a different approach with a scene that has been invented just for the screen. Now, in the book, Sir Stefan Fossaway's squire, Raymond, only apologizes for asking him to joust with his cousin and then sends Dunk on his way, but in the show, we see Raymond inviting Dunk to a party as compensation. Inevitably, the moment in question finds Dunk in Lyonel's tent, drinking his ale and eating his food. Lyonel immediately spots him as someone out of place, and the Lord is just equally confused and surprised when it turns out that the Hedge Knight wasn't there for his help nor for his head. From there, they drink together, laugh together, and most surprisingly, dance together. We don't think we've seen characters having so much fun in Westeros in a long time, but this sequence truly feels fun, silly, a little bit chaotic, a tad surreal, and rather unique with Lyonel at the center of it. This Baratheon's aura is unfettered, and honestly, the only person who could match up to that is probably Oberyn Martell. And yes, he's an ancestor of Robert Baratheon, most likely his great-grandfather, and displays the standard Baratheon trifecta of traits, which is loving a good wine, loving a good banquet, and loving a good fight. But really, it's not every day you see a man of his stature allow someone like Dunk to wear his antler headpiece. We loved how he also allowed the space for Dunk to talk about his issues, even if Lyonel didn't exactly offer any sort of help. In all honesty, fun-loving Lyonel seems to be genuinely flirting with Dunk, who just innocently beams at the attention of a great lord. It's Lyonel who encourages Dunk to be more self-confident and to own his nature, because Dunk was tall, and so he should be tall. It's advice that Dunk clearly internalizes, because later, when he finds young Egg at his camp and asks his name, Dunk finally utters the name he chose for himself, Sir Duncan the Tall. This deeper connection with Lyonel is an invention of the show, but a fitting one, given that Lyonel and Dunk's fates would be linked long after Ashford. In case you're wondering, decades after the events of the Ashford Meadow tourney, tourney where they met for the first time when Lyonel declared himself as the Storm King in an act of open rebellion against King Egg on the Fifth, aka Egg. It was Sir Duncan the Tall who defeated the Laughing Storm during a trial by combat, thus putting an end to the rebellion and bringing Lyonel back into the king's graces. The shooting star scene was altered in the show. We think the first episode of the show ended in the most beautiful way, with Dunk returning to his camp only to find Egg roasting a fish on the fire he lit after riding all the way to Ashford in the back of a farmer's cart. The young boy had not only washed Dunk's clothes, he had also set up the campsite before cooking dinner. After an endearing conversation, Dunk decides to officially take on Egg as a squire. The slow zoom on Egg's surprised expression as Dunk describes what this will entail is a shot that lives rent-free in our minds, and if you know the details of Egg's story from the books, you already know how much this scene takes on a whole new meaning as Dunk levels with him in such an honest and kind way that the boy was simply just not used to. The final scene of the episode sees our hedge knight and squire bunk down together beneath their elm tree for the first time while a shooting star soars overhead. We get a last endearing moment between them where Egg tries to talk about how they're the only ones seeing the star because all the other knights are sleeping in tents. Initially, Dunk threatens him with a clout in the ear before slowly realizing that the shooting star may just mean that the luck was theirs alone, while Egg smiled to himself. Now, when that falling star crosses the night sky above our heroes, there's a tiny dialogue change made exclusively for the show. In the book, Egg is said to be asleep, so Dunk thinks to himself that a falling star brings luck to those who see it, but because the rest of them were all in their pavilions by now, staring up at the silk instead of the sky, all the luck would be his alone. Of course, in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, it's Egg who says the first part of the sentence, with Dunk chiming in to ask if the luck was theirs alone. In response, we see Egg turn his back and smile before the credits start to roll. Well, that brings us to the very end of this video. Honestly, we know it's only been one episode, but we already love the softness and the character-driven nature of the show. At least, we don't have any complaint for these welcome changes made for the screen, but we'd love to hear about your thoughts. What do you think about these changes? Let us know in the comment section down below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.